All right, hello. Welcome to another edition of Trek Talk, where I'll be taking a look at a episode of the original Star Trek series and examining it in depth. And also, we'll be reading from Mark Cushman's book. These are the voyages, where I'll talk about some behind-the-scenes material. So this week, as usual, this week I'm taking a look at the Menagerie Part 2. And I don't know why the font isn't on the screen there properly. I don't know. It's the same image that I use for the thumbnail. And I don't know why, but it's happened once before in one of the episodes where I put it up here and then the font doesn't look right. I don't know why that happens, but anyway, so we're picking up from part 1 of the Menagerie, and in the first issue, of course, Spock hijacks the Enterprise for unknown reasons. Eventually, Kirk catches up and gets back on board the ship, and then a trial or court martial for Spock ensues, with Kirk and Commodore Mendez here presiding, along with Captain Pike, to determine why Spock is doing this. And Spock is, of course, just wants them to, he declines to explain, but they're shown a bunch of images, which are basically footage from the original Star Trek pilot, The Cage, detailing Pike's mission from years earlier, saying that that will explain everything. So we'll just go ahead and get into the episode here. So the previous episode concludes, and then the court martial resumes, and the footage of The Cage in Pike's adventure on Talos IV, I think it's about 13 years earlier, continues, and we see how he got captured by the Talosians. He is then put through a series of what are basically fantasies or simulations, which are mentally created by the Talosians, who have advanced mental abilities of telepathy and illusion, in which he's placed into these fantasies that are based on his own memories with this woman, Vina, and they're obviously geared towards trying to get him to emotionally bond with her or become enamored with her. We see an adventure with him on Rigel. Is it Rigel 12? It's one of the Rigels. Years earlier. Then that concludes. Then he's put into a new fantasy where he's back on some property that his family owned back on Earth. And then we get the old Green Orion slave girl sequence, which is obviously supposed to be more alluring for him. And Kirk's like, that's the girl Mina. And Mendez is like, it's the line from the original episode, but in this case, Mendez says it, but he says something about how they're seductive and have they're irresistible to men and have voracious sexual appetites or something like that. And Kirk's like, you don't say. But since it's not working with Vina, they bring down number 1 and Yeoman Hoyt, I think is her name, from the Enterprise, and put them in there as well, until Pike, he has a choice here. But eventually Mendez gets kind of fed up with this and basically decides, I've had enough of this. Let's have a judgment. And he asks Pike, what do you say? Do you say guilty? And Pike signals, yes, he's guilty. Mendez says guilty as well. Then they ask Kirk, and Kirk also says, yes, guilty. Then the Enterprise arrives at Talos IV and goes into orbit around the planet. Then the images of the cage resume, and
Pike is able to get a hold of a weapon and threatens to kill a Talosian. Eventually, he convinces them to take them back up to the surface. And then the Talosian tells them, the Keeper, of course, this is the one who's running things, and this Talosian's called the Keeper, and tells them that the Talosians want them basically to repopulate the planet. The Talosians, their world and their race is dying. And that's why they've brought humans here basically as breeding stock, for lack of a better term. And they want the humans to start repopulating the planet. And they're not going to let them leave. And then number one sets her laser on overload. And, and the Talosian's like shocked at this and can't believe that these humans would rather die than be kept in captivity, even if the captivity is going to be fairly comfortable. So then they let the females go back up to the ship. Pike wants Vina to go with him. Vina says she can't go. And then, of course, the Talosians take away the illusion around Vina and reveal what she really looks like. And first of all, she's older than she is was in the illusion, because I think she's actually like maybe 40s, maybe even early 50s or something like that. But the main thing is that although she survived the crash years earlier, her body was badly wrecked by it, and the Talosians did a poor job of sort of repairing her. So she's very deformed, and she has a hump, and she walks with a pronounced limp, and she's just in a sad state. And says, I can't go with you. She'd rather stay here and live in the illusion the Talosians give her of youth and beauty, which, under the circumstances, it's hard to really blame her for that. Hello, Adega. Thanks for stopping by, sir. Once again, always good to see you. And then Pike returns to the ship, although they do return her youth and beauty back to her, and tells the others Venus staying and that he agrees with her reasoning why. And it's at this point that Kirk seems to kind of realize what this is all about. He rather meaningfully looks at Pike, in the state that Pike is in. And I think at this point, Kirk kind of realizes what's going on here. And then he turns to Mendez, saying, I forget exactly what he says, but maybe we should reconsider our verdict or some such. And then the big plot twist comes. Mendez disappears. He was never there. It was all a dream, a hoax, an imaginary story. Uh, Mendez, at least the Mendez that has been here that was in the shuttlecraft with Kirk and that is here on the Enterprise, was just an illusion. Mendez is real, but he never left the starbase. He stayed back on the starbase. And then they get a message from Uhura telling them that apparently the Mendez back on the starbase also received these images about Pike's mission, and says that uh, he's determined that under these circumstances, and I don't remember if it was exactly him or maybe it was Starfleet Command itself. I don't remember, but basically they're told that under the circumstances, General Order Number 1 is being waived. So no death penalty for Spock. And tell Kirk that he can kind of handle this the way he sees best. He then asks Captain Pike, do you want this? Do you want to go down there? Which understandably Pike is like, yeah. And he tells Spock to take Pike to the transporter room. And then subsequently, Kirk sees Pike back down on the planet with Vina. And of course, with the Talosians' mental illusions, they're now both happy and healthy and presumably going to live happily ever after. And the episode ends there. And also, and I think I talked about this last episode, but of course, the original episode of The Cage was directed by Robert Butler. Now, the other episodes, the Menagerie sequences, if you want, with Kirk and Spock and everybody, those were directed by Mark Daniels. And they basically struck a deal where, because most of the Menagerie or most of the cage footage was in the second episode, they struck a deal where Mark Daniels got director credit on part one, and then Robert Butler, as we can see here, got director credit on part two. And they Roddenberry had contacted Butler at one point and said, "Hey, would you like to do these updated sequences?" So he could direct the whole thing and have all the credit for it. And Butler basically was like, "Thanks, but no thanks." Butler apparently was not a a big Star Trek fan, as he said. He didn't. What was the word? I think he said it's this. It said something to the effect of he just didn't see any value in his work on Star Trek. Okay, so that concludes that episode. Now, I've already talked about most of the behind the scenes stuff last episode, so I'm not going to go into all of that here. Uh, but what I'm going to do is the next part of the book by Cushman uh, goes in. It's a chapter about the state of Star Trek at the mid-season point of this first season, and what was going on behind the scenes at that point, particularly regarding Roddenberry and his dealings with the network, and also the kind of the scramble they were under just to get episodes made. So I'll go back to the book here. All right, so even the people who thought they could figure television had trouble explaining the effect Star Trek was having on its audience. The critics, for the most part, may have panned the premiere installment, but the ratings had been phenomenal. Within weeks, it was clear this was not just another TV show. Dorothy Fontana said, quote, "The first week we got some mail. The second week we got a bag of mail. After that, we started getting bags of mail to the point where the mailroom literally couldn't handle it all. Pretty soon, the actors couldn't even answer all the letters they were getting. They had to have mail services taking care of their mail for them. So the mail was telling us that there were fans out there, and they were not fans writing to say, just send me a picture. They were writing to make comment on the show, and they were intelligent comments. We had a great audience." And so the buzz began to build. The September 21st, 1966 headline in the Los Angeles Times read, quote, "Star Trek is a costly sci-fi epic." Staff writer Don Page described the series as, quote, "one of the most expensive and elaborate productions in the history of television," unquote. It was a point NBC wanted driven home. Mr. Page was especially impressed with the bridge of the Enterprise, writing, "If the show happens to fail television, they could easily turn the set into a tourist attraction," which, of course, I think, as most of us probably know, as something that has actually happened. Universal Studios theme park would do that 22 years later, and actually, I think there are other sets. I think there's one up in New York somewhere, and then there's the that studio, the one that did Star Trek Continues, down in, as I think it's in Georgia, and they have a reconstruction of the set as well, and I believe that's also a tourist attraction. So there are multiple ones. In the letters section of TV Guide on November 5th, 1966, Andrew Porter, the assistant editor for Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine, wrote that Irwin Allen, with The Time Tunnel, was only, quote, "interested in creating a series which will sell him as a producer and sell the sponsor's product." Porter praised Roddenberry and Star Trek for taking a different approach by, quote, "appealing to the intelligence of the viewer," unquote. On November 13th, 1966, Marion Purcelli of the Chicago Tribune, looking for another angle, wrote, "The most way out fashion design for women to come along in months is the miniskirt." And that's exactly the look designer Bill Theiss has created for Star Trek. Theiss did not invent the miniskirt. That actually happened in England about 1 month earlier. But Star Trek's hemlines were clearly at the forefront of the event, and they were the shortest skirts to date. William Shatner, for a newspaper article syndicated during October 1966, said, quote, All the plots have a basis in human experience or fact, and all the equipment is authentic. The stories will have an extension of human experience in a different environment. That same day, for the TV magazine of Boston Sunday Herald, Shatner said, quote, "If Shakespeare were alive today, he'd be doing science fiction. It would challenge that great imagination of his." For a syndicated article picked up by the Boston Sunday Herald for its December 18th TV magazine, the headline read, "Shatner catches a big wave." Yeah. Yeah, that's really close though, isn't it? I had no idea that mini skirts were actually literally invented just like a week. What did it say? Like 1 month? Yeah, just 1 month before Star Trek. I didn't know that. So that the show very nearly did if it had come out just maybe a month or two earlier. Um, the headline read, "Shatner catches a big wave." The Star explained, "You have to catch a wave just as it crests. Like last year, I did a courtroom show for the people. It only lasted 13 weeks. Everyone liked the show, but our timing was wrong. We were too late with a lawyer show, with a message drama. We missed the cresting of lawyer shows when audiences were fascinated by them." Hello, Jay Rocker. Hello, sir. Thank you for stopping by. Greetings. Yes, good to see you. As series lead and primary spokesman, Shatner was showered with plenty of positive press. Try saying that 5 times fast. In the March 12, 1967 issue of the San Francisco Examiner and Chronicle, John Stanley presented an article entitled "Captain Kirk, Man of Tomorrow." He wrote, "Roddenberry's promise last summer that we're taking the weirdest stuff and making it as believable as possible has been realized. Even the main character, James T. Kirk, has become a futuristic personality, as portrayed by William Shatner. Because Shatner has labored to make him a well-fleshed individual, Kirk has emerged as a firm symbol of authority who makes mind-boggling decisions with the calm efficiency and certainty of a man accustomed to moving through space at 186,000 miles per second." Or much faster than that, actually. Boy, that's a puff piece, isn't it? By mid-October, the tide was changing. The TV magazine with the article on Star Trek that included Shatner's line about Shakespeare did not use a picture of Captain Kirk for its cover, but one of Mr. Spock, alone. Only a few weeks after hitting the airwaves, a new and unexpected phenomenon was making itself known. It would soon be given a name, Spock Mania. A letter printed in TV Guide from October 1966 read, quote, "Hooray for the guy with the ears and eyebrows on Star Trek. At last, someone who is really different." Or sort of. Frank Judge for the Boston Sunday Herald on October 23rd, 1966 observed, quote, "While Shatner gets top billing, Leonard Nimoy is piling up mountains of fan mail on his own." Mr. Spock was again featured solo on a magazine cover, this time for the January 6, 1967 issue of TV Showtime. The caption read, quote, "Romantic image with pointed ears." For the article entitled "New Breed of TV Hero," Tom Weigel wrote, "TV viewers, especially the teen variety, find Nimoy an intriguing new variation of the cool, hard-to-rattle hero. Trek's actual star is William Shatner, traditionally a handsome fellow who has been all but ignored by fans in their current predilection for the offbeat hero." I'm sure Shatner doesn't mind that at all. I'm sure he's fine with it. Uh, Writer Leslie Redditz took note that the bulk of Nimoy's fan mail came from teenagers. Nimoy's explanation was, quote, "The kids dig the fact that Spock is cool." Roddenberry added, "We're all imprisoned within ourselves. We're all aliens on this strange planet, so people find identification with Spock." Nimoy understood this. He told Reddit, "I don't want to play a creature or a computer. Spock gives me a chance to say some things about the human race." Isaac Asimov wrote in TV Guide on April 29th, 1967, an article entitled "Mr. Spock is Dreamy." Asimov's 12-year-old daughter gave her father the article's title. She had said, "I think that Mr. Spock is dreamy. He's so smart," prompting Asimov to write, "The not quite human thinking machine may be starting a new trend in sex appeal. A revolution of incalculable importance is sweeping America thanks to Star Trek, which, in its noble and successful effort to present good science fiction to the American public, has also presented everyone with an astonishing revelation." And here I had been watching Star Trek since its inception because I like it, because it's well done, it's exciting, because it says things subtly and neatly that are difficult to say in straight drama, and because science fiction, properly presented, is the type of literature most appropriate to our generation. But it hadn't occurred to me that Mr. Spock was sexy. I had never realized that such a thing was possible, that girls palpitate over the way one eyebrow goes up at a fraction, that they squeal with passion when a little smile quirks his lips. And it's all because he's smart. In a New York Times article titled "Girls All Want to Touch the Ears," Nimoy said, quote, "There must be something very sexual about it. I tell you, frankly, I've never had more female attention on a set before, and they all want to touch the ears." It was a phenomenon that baffled TV insiders and intellectuals all across America. It, it also baffled William Shatner. But I mean, it's not it's just it's a real I think it's a real good example of people not really understanding their audience, and how these studio executives or people high up in these entertainment companies, they really aren't they really don't have a grasp of what a lot of their audience even wants. And that's not a new thing. It's just that in the past, if you weren't giving them what they want, they'd go, okay, well, let's do something indifferent so they'll watch. Whereas now it's like, shut up, bigot, watch it. All right. Casting director Joe Agosta said, quote, "Everybody talked about Spock and Leonard Nimoy because he was so interesting. He was the guy that everybody gave all the credit to, all the accolades, writing about, wow, this Leonard Nimoy is the show. But Bill was the secret weapon on that show because Bill got reams of dialogue and he'd give it excitement. And all Leonard did was raise his eyebrow and say, that's illogical. It was illogical, understandable, but illogical. Shatner was the energy." Hmm. As early as the start of June 1966, over 2 months before Gene Coon came to Star Trek, Roddenberry was desperate for help. His battles with many of the show's writers he hired, TV writers unable to deal with the demands of science fiction or science fiction writers unable to deal with the demands of TV, were wearing him down. Stan Robertson at NBC was unhappy with many of the story outlines coming from Roddenberry's office and was now becoming more and more critical. Roddenberry's disdain for the network was growing. In a letter to his agent, Alden Schwimmer, he wrote, "There seems to be a popular delusion that networks do people a favor by buying shows. I happen to think the truth is somewhat nearer the other direction, that a man who creates a format and offers integrity and a large hunk of his life in producing it offers much more than networks or advertisers can give in return. Therefore, it logically follows that side has a right to some terms too." It was a fair criticism, but not a criticism that NBC would appreciate hearing. That the network was being over demanding, unhelpful, and with giving insufficient time and funding, doing nearly everything possible to sabotage the very quality it demanded from its series producers. This salvo, in the eyes of the producers, was strike 8 for Roddenberry. While Roddenberry battled his celebrity writers in the network, associate producer Robert Justman continued to fight his seemingly losing battle over trying to meet higher production expectations with insufficient funding to realize them. The arrival of Gene Coon as the new first chair producer did nothing to help with Justman's concerns, including the mandated air dates that he was certain would not be met. Optical effects were still proving to be the main cause for delays. On October 19th, 1966, Justman wrote to Roddenberry, as well as Gene Kuhn, Eddie Milkis, and Herb Solow, saying that Lynn Dunn and his company Film Effects of Hollywood was Star Trek's new primary supplier of its post-production miniatures and obstacles, or opticals, not obstacles. The Howard Anderson Company, for the time being, was out. The Westheimer Company was being kept as a secondary supplier, designated to taking care of the trailer, optical work, and in titles. More than 3 weeks passed, and Justman still had nothing to look at from Lynn Dunn and Film Effects of Hollywood. On November 11th, he went above Milkis and wrote directly to Herb Solow at NBC saying, "I hope and pray that we are not being faced with another Anderson situation," which I'm not really sure what he means by that. Justman asked Solo to ask Bill Heath to make arrangements for Joe Westheimer to pick up more Star Trek shows just in case. On the same day, Justman wrote to Gene Kuhn, pleading for him to make the necessary changes to the new batch of scripts in order to scale back on the effects needed for upcoming episodes. As this latest problem presented itself, the Star Trek staff were hoping for a miracle, and then they got one. On December 1st, 1966, Star Trek was preempted by a Jack Benny special. The Menagerie Part 1 and Part 2 had bought a week's worth of breathing room. Now Jack Benny's special brought the series another week, but that was still 1 week short. There would be no new episodes ready for December 29th. On that night, a repeat of What Are Little Girls Made Of was substituted into the schedule. The network was not happy. ABC and CBS would have new programs to run. Star Trek was bound to take a hit in the ratings, and it did. Up against first-run competition, the repeat of What Are Little Girls Made Of was the lowest-rated Star Trek episode in the first season. When aired several weeks earlier, Little Girls had beaten the CBS Thursday night movie in a close race. At its peak, Star Trek drew 29.5% of the TVs in use. For this rerun, the best it could do was third place and a 22.5 audience share. Failing to make delivery of a required first-run episode was an unprecedented breach of contract, as well as trust in the eyes of NBC. And since Gene Roddenberry was the executive producer, the man at the desk where the buck stops, this was seen by the network as strike number 9 for Roddenberry. The pressure on Star Trek's producers was not letting up. Immediately following the mid-season pickup, Roddenberry, Kuhn, and Justman received word that Desilu was cutting Star Trek's budget. The money for each episode was reduced from $193,500 to $185,000. The dark predictions made by the old guard at Desilu that Star Trek and Mission Impossible would bankrupt the studio were becoming a reality. With money concerns on everyone's minds, Theodore Sturgeon's Shore Leave was rushed through a series of rewrites. It was too big, too fantastic, and too expensive. Harlan Ellison's The City on the Edge of Forever was nearly ready, or so Ellison was telling them, but it too required location shoots as well as specialty sets and numerous extras, and it too would clearly exceed the budget and therefore needed further rewrites. The series creative team was learning that most TV writers could not handle a series as intricate as Star Trek, and most science fiction writers with concepts too big to fit inside a small screen were striking out too. The list of casualties, all with Star Trek money lining their pockets, was growing. Roddenberry was the first name on the list. Roddenberry's The Omega Glory was paid for, only to be put on the shelf per the request of NBC. Stan Robertson didn't like the script, nor did Herb Solow, nor did Roddenberry's own right-hand man, Robert Justman. And then they go through a rather lengthy section where they talk about a lot of unproduced scripts that were proposed or written up by sci-fi writers that wound up basically just being that either people didn't like or they were just too expensive. Some of them got rewritten. Like one of them got rewritten and became a piece of the action. Another one became a Lon of Troyes. There were some others, but I'm going to skip that section because it's pretty long. Let's see where to pick up here. Okay, I'll stop with like the last one here. So one of the last ones they talk about is this was actually the 28th script that was written, and it was titled Portrait in Black and White. One of Roddenberry's story concepts from the Star Trek series proposal, it was given to Barry Trivers for further writing. Roddenberry had promised Trivers another assignment in exchange for a fourth rewrite on his script for The Conscience of the King, and this was it. Portrait of Black and White was a parallel world story, this one resembling the old plantation days of the South, but reversed, with whites being enslaved and auctioned off by black slave owners. Yeah, I'm sure that I'm sure that would have gone over well. Long story short, the network hated it, and really nobody liked it. Nobody liked the script except Roddenberry. Roddenberry liked these Jonathan Swift typed parallel world stories. He had his heart set on Black and White. He was also irked over NBC Desilu and his staff not rallying behind the Omega glory. And so on August 29th, he spanked Justman uh, by writing to Kuhn. Agree that aspects of this tale, if properly handled, could bring the white and black power advocates down on us with a vengeance. On the other hand, we could be in trouble with someone on any dynamic theme, i.e., union labor, peace, war, utopia, individuality, etc. This theme, if handled intelligently, and it is our duty to see that it is handled intelligently, can be highly provocative, entertaining, and a revealing exercise in dramatic truths, making points via its sci-fi approach that never could be made in a non-sci-fi setting. I can give you 37 reasons why every story we have ever received started out as illogical, tasteless, too expensive, etc. Half the job is, of course, in pointing out the above. The other half is in seeking replacements for these points, things that we can and should do to make it into the kind of script we can all be proud of. 2 days later, Stan Robertson spoke for the network. The rejection was short and not sweet. Quote, "We believe this story does not fit into the Star Trek concept. Period." Roddenberry had fought NBC before over his right as a writer producer to do a program about the black and white issue of racial prejudice. That episode of The Lieutenant had led to the series being canceled. But Roddenberry remained undaunted. Trivers wrote his script of the first draft on September 28th. Gene Kuhn received memos from Steve Karabatzos, and indications are Dorothy Fontana as well in an unofficial capacity. Let's see. Kuhn worked with the script, as did Roddenberry, but neither ever won support from NBC over the controversial material. If Roddenberry had proceeded to produce Portrait in Black and White, it never would have aired. Both he and Kuhn had ignored the most important rule of the Jonathan Swift technique to making commentary on political and current social stigmas. You need to use enough science fiction to disguise it in order to get it past the censors. Let's see here. And then they go through some more of these other unproduced scripts. And there's a lot of them. I'd say there's probably close to at least 30 scripts here they mentioned that were either proposed, that were written or at least proposed that never got made into episodes for various reasons. Um, there were also unsolicited submissions or treatments that Star Trek did not request. And with one exception, they did not pay for. Philip Jose Farmer, one of them three famed sci-fi writers who weren't quick to take no for an answer, sent in numerous story ideas during Star Trek's first season. Mere Shadows came in on March 22nd, 1966, nearly 6 months before the series even premiered. The story has a woman rescued from a wrecked prospecting ship and then falling in love with Kirk. Heartsick over his lack of interest, she arms herself with a phaser, takes over engineering, and sets the Enterprise hurtling through space at speeds never before attempted. This causes the ship to break through, quote, the skin of the universe, unquote, and become trapped in a space void, which I think they did a couple episodes kind of like that on Next Generation, didn't they? Not with a heartbroken woman doing it, but they were accidents. Something like this would be tried in 1968 with Is There in Truth No Beauty, but in 1966, the optical effects available could not even begin to satisfy the story. Image of the Beast, submitted 5 days later by Farmer, had Kirk and a landing party beaming down to the middle of a vast desert on a barren planet at the site of a wreck of an immense alien spaceship. The Enterprise crew search the ghost vessel and then begin experiencing memory losses and strange hallucinations. We learn that during one of their blackouts, they had devices implanted into their skulls, allowing communication from the telepathic aliens. Once again, costs were prohibitive, and NBC would never go for something this cerebral. The Uncoiler was a third try from Farmer, this time responding to a distress call from an uninhabited world. The men of the Enterprise encounter a long bearded old man clothed in rags living deep in a jungle. They also find the wreck of his small spaceship, the ruins of an ancient city, and a statue of an idol allegedly worshipped by a long dead alien race. The old man refuses to be rescued unless Kirk agrees to beam down the statue of the alien idol back to the Enterprise. Beam the statue back to the Enterprise, and Kirk relents. Back on the ship, Kirk becomes confused and experiences memory lapses. Then Spock starts forgetting things. The ship's two top officers are having on again, off again amnesia, and the cause, a group of aliens called the Zaltots, who had transferred their minds into the statue. The statue had communicated to the old man to call for help and have it taken aboard the rescue ship so that the Zaltots could then be transported to a populated world in order to live vicariously through other beings. The Zaltots are referred to as electronic vampires, and during the 48-hour period needed for the, quote, encoding and transferring to take over a human's mind, Kirk and Spock write notes to one another whenever they get an idea and before they forget it. These notes eventually help them find a means to exorcise the aliens from their minds. So kind of like a Star Trek version of, was it Memento? Isn't it that movie where the guy he's got the short-term memory problem, and he has to write down everything? The Star Trek people requested and paid for a second draft outline dated April 5th. John D.F. Black's final word on it to Roddenberry from April 22nd, quote, I agree with you, it just doesn't make it, unquote. The Rebels Unthawed was Farmer's last effort of the year, and it was considered too much like Space Seed, a story that was already in development at that time. Sleeping Beauty was an outline sent in on spec from Robert Bloch after he finished his share of the work on What Are Little Girls Made Of? His new story involved a 21st century gangster who puts himself into suspended animation to avoid being prosecuted for crimes. Bloch had it that the gangster is found and revived by the crew of the Enterprise. Gene Kuhn immediately nixed that idea. The premise again was too similar to Space Seed. Other writers tried to make a sale to Star Trek but came up short with their pitch sessions. And then they named several TV writers. These are mostly TV writers, not sci-fi writers. And they don't go into any detail, so I'm not really going to talk about that. Oh, there is one, actually. William Shatner wanted a writing assignment, too. Roddenberry, speaking with Michael Fessier for an October 1966 article in TV Guide, said of Shatner, quote, he came in and said, I have a few comments about this script. And I thought, oh no. But Shatner surprised Roddenberry, who told the TV Guide writer, quote, I've never had a more intelligent suggestions, and we used all of them. And then Shatner handed Roddenberry a story he had written. Roddenberry said, quote, he wouldn't let me take it home to read. He insisted on reading it right there, so I fortified myself with a scotch and prepared to suffer. But the story flowed and was so damn poetic, I caught myself wishing I could write that well, unquote. Roddenberry passed the story and the buck to Gene Coon, who, either not liking the idea or not liking the idea of letting one of his actors write for the show, said no. Quote, I've submitted 3 scripts for the series, Shatner said for an article syndicated to numerous newspapers in October 1966. None had been assigned a Star Trek production number. Shatner, like Kirk, never one to give up easily, added, quote, I also very much want to direct. I've been promised, if the series continues, I can do so. There is no evidence of these 3 scripts in the Star Trek show files, but one story treatment, The Web of Death, dated from April 29th and credited to Shatner, has survived. In the story, the Enterprise comes upon its sister ship, the USS Momentous, at a dead stop near a planet. There is no life on board, but Kirk and an away team do discover the crew's uniforms lying about the ship, even draped over chairs. All the food is gone from the ship as well, and holes have been pierced in the outer hull. As the Enterprise crew investigates, they find the reason: a giant ravenous spider in space. I guess I don't know. I don't know if that's where. Well, yeah, I guess it wouldn't be the where John Peters got his idea for that giant spider in the Superman movie. Of the shift in power from Roddenberry to Coon, the former said, Roddenberry said, I had no choice. The only way I could get people like Gene Coon to come in and produce, and I needed a producer, was to become executive producer. I had to get some extra people in any way I could. And a new system was now moving into place. William Shatner said, quote, Gene Coon had more to do with the infusion of life into Star Trek than any other single person. Gene Coon set the tenor of the show. Roddenberry was more in the background. Not completely so, as the interoffice memo shared here will continue to indicate, but Roddenberry, already exhausted midway through the first season, was ready to let Coon lead the charge. Robert Justman said, quote, Gene Coon was a brilliant find. You couldn't get anyone better. David Gerrold, a future Star Trek writer who signed on during Coon's watch, said, quote, when Gene Coon came on board, you start getting things like the Prime Directive and a lot of stuff that was later identified as the nobler parts of Star Trek. Gene Coon created that noble image that everyone gives Roddenberry the most credit for, unquote. Shatner said, quote, Gene Coon created many of the basic conceptual points. The Klingons, the Organian Peace Treaty, and the Prime Directive were all conceived by Coon. Coon also added more humor to the characters, perhaps an even more important contribution. David Gerrold noted, when Gene Coon took over, the characters locked into place very tightly and crisply. Dorothy Fontana added, quote, the humor between the characters began to become more and more developed, particularly the Spock and McCoy relationship became a lot more fun. It evolved into what it eventually became, a basic friendship. Gene Coon led the way on that. Shatner said, Coon's brand of humor always grew organically from within the characters. Captain Kirk never slipped on a banana peel for a laugh. We were never put Spock in drag. Instead, Coon felt that Star Trek's humorous moments could be used to deepen our characters and the relationship between them, unquote. And, I think that really sticks out as one of the differences between humor, say, in Star Trek and in some other properties of the sort, and in the kind of humor they do in Marvel, and really just generally kind of in current modern Hollywood, where it's really there, it seems more often than not to humiliate the male characters and make them look stupid or make them look weak or whatever. Hmm, where was I? Okay. The show was pretty straightforward in the beginning, Dorothy Fontana echoed, but then we realized that anytime we'd give the characters something humorous to play, the show really sparkled. Coon needed a few weeks to get up to speed, but now with the next group of episodes coming in, that sparkle, the magic of Gene Coon was about to make itself known. All right, so it ends there, that chapter. Now, oh, and I didn't give this one a grade. So I'll give the Menagerie Part 2 a B plus. I mean, on its own, There's really not a whole lot to it. Obviously, it's basically largely just a rerun of The Cage. And as I've said before, I've already done a Trek Talk on The Cage. So if you want to know my thoughts on that, please do check that out. And Jay Rocker says, yeah, you're thinking of the spider too. Yeah. I mean, I think that's going to be kind of a thing now. Whenever you mention a giant spider, people are going to be thinking of that anecdote that Kevin Smith told. And which finally saw fruition in The Flash when they had that little bit where Nicolas Cage's Superman is fighting a giant spider. Okay. Um, so the next episode is episode 17 in production order. That is Shore Leave. So I will come back next week, probably. I think, let me think. I don't know. I might not. I might be busy next week. So I'll have to see closer to the weekend, over the weekend, if I'm going to be able to do that or not. Because I may have to skip next week. We'll see. But anyway, if I don't, then the week after that, I'll be doing Shore Leave. So I'll go ahead and wrap it up there. And thanks to those who have tuned in during the stream. Dega, J Rocker, thank you for stopping by. And also thanks to those who will catch the stream on a rewatch. Please do like the stream and please do sub to the channel. And I will be back next week. As far as videos, now, if you haven't checked it out yet, so this past Saturday, I did drop a new AI trailer. It's basically I did a second trailer for Thundar. This one's longer. It's like a 3-minute long trailer. If you haven't checked that out, please do give that a look. And I think, and similarly, I'm not sure if I'll stream this weekend either. I may not have time. We'll see. But anyway, I'll wrap it up there, and hopefully I will be back next week. Everyone, have a good evening.